Hello, this is Wes Terasaki. Today we are studying Nehemiah chapter 6. In chapter 5, we took a departure from the focus on wall building and spent time on the building up of people. You could say we were temporarily off the wall. Now, in chapter 6, we are back on the wall. The entire chapter has to do with the reaction of outsiders and insiders to the near completion of the construction project. The reaction is revealing. To me, it seems like panic. If we had to recount the storyline, we probably could do it in about 5 sentences. The wall is completed, all except for the doors. Sanballat and Geshem try to coax Nehemiah to meet with them in a remote area away from Jerusalem in a failed attempt to get rid of him. They invent a false motive for the reconstruction efforts, namely that the Jews are planning a revolt against Persia and plan to make Nehemiah their king. Sanballat and Tobiah hire a so-called prophet named Shemaiah to tell Nehemiah that his life is in danger, which may be true, and that he needs to go into the temple for protection. This is an underhanded attempt to discredit Nehemiah. Tobiah uses the commercial connections and family ties he has to try to intimidate Nehemiah and undermine his authority. That's the story in a nutshell, but of course there's a lot more to the chapter. That's why we're studying it today. Perhaps the most difficult portions come at the end, where we encounter a bunch of new names, and just when we've learned to pronounce Zerubbabel and Sanballat. Try these names on for size: Delaiah, Mehetabel, Jehohanan, and Arah. That's a mouthful, huh? Incidentally, this is another good reason to get a good Bible dictionary. It tells us how to pronounce the names. Actually, there are 9 new names at the end of Nehemiah 6. But don't get too intimidated by these characters you've never heard of. No one else has ever heard of Delaiah or Mehetabel either. We know nothing else about the false prophetess Noadiah. And if they were not listed here as being related to Tobiah, we would know nothing about Shechaniah, Arah, Jehohanan, or Berechiah. So you might be relieved to know that there are only 2 out of the 9 people we ought to know something about, just 2. They are Shemaiah and Meshullam. Shemaiah is the false prophet we mentioned earlier. His name can confuse us because there are a number of other Shemaiahs found in Ezra and Nehemiah. This one is the prophet for hire who is working with Tobiah and Sanballat to deceive Nehemiah and try to discredit him. We have no other information on him as a prophet, but apparently he must have been known as one in the Jewish community. Shemaiah's tactics are a little difficult to figure out. He tries to get Nehemiah to fear for his life and seek refuge in the temple. I frankly don't know why this would be a good idea. The temple area is a sacred area, and the inner sanctuary can be accessed only by priests. When God initially established the priesthood with Aaron and his descendants, the penalty for transgression was clear. You and your sons, the priests, must personally handle all the priestly rituals associated with the altar and with everything behind the inner curtain. I'm giving you the priesthood as your special privilege of service. Any unauthorized person who comes too near the sanctuary will be put to death. Nehemiah is not a priest, so how can entering the temple protect him? Back before there even was a temple, one of David's sons, Adonijah, attempted to declare himself king. When he failed, he sought protection by holding on to the horns of the altar. In the end, he was executed. Many years later, one of the kings of Judah, Uzziah, unlawfully entered Solomon's temple, and he was struck with leprosy. Fortunately, Nehemiah didn't bite at Shemaiah's suggestion. Meshullam is mentioned often in Nehemiah. He is a priest, and he helps repair the wall in chapter 3, helps Ezra read the law in chapter 8, seals the covenant with Nehemiah in chapter 10, and participates in the dedication of the wall in chapter 12. So he appears to be a dedicated follower of God and an active participant in the religious activities of Israel. Unfortunately, his daughter is married to Tobiah's son. In fact, many in Judah were bound by oath to Tobiah because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, son of Erah, and his son, Jehohanan, had taken the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah, as his wife. When we look at Tobiah's relationships by marriage, we see that he is well connected with extended and influential Jewish families. Later in chapter 13, we see that Tobiah is also friends with Eliashib, a priest who even gives him a room in the temple. I think this explains why some of the nobles are communicating regularly with Tobiah and have a high regard for him. And we now start to see that there may have been considerable internal opposition to the wall building project. Nehemiah was being pressured and opposed from outside the Jewish nation as well as from within. We can look at Nehemiah chapter 6 and just see stories of ill will, deceit, and favoritism, but there is much more that God intends to show us. Our Bible study tip for today is, don't miss the forest for the trees. I'm sure you've heard this expression before. It means, don't get so caught up in the details that you lose sight of the overall picture. Don't develop tunnel vision. How does one actually do this? How can you see the whole forest? Well, I suggest 3 ways. 1, look at the forest all at once. 2, look at it over and over. And 3, look at it from different vantage points. That's all pretty obvious, and you probably know where I'm going with this. When reading scripture, look at the forest all at once by reading the entire book all the way through in a single sitting. Do this quickly without stopping to look up terms and phrases that are unclear. Read it much like you would read a novel. It is worth setting aside blocks of time to do this. Number 2, look at the forest over and over. That is, read the entire book all the way through more than once. Pastor Joe gave us this as a Bible study tip for chapter 4. The third suggestion is to look at Scripture from more than one vantage point. That is, use at least one other good Bible translation. That was our Bible study tip from last session. Reading the entire book in one sitting, reading it more than once, and reading it in a different Bible translation enable us to capture ideas and events that we might otherwise miss, to pick up nuances in Scripture, and to make connections between verses located in different sections, and we can appreciate the broader themes and concepts of the Bible. Let me close by giving you a couple of examples of how we can benefit from looking at the forest. Prayer. Prayer seems to be a major theme in Nehemiah. You may have already surmised this from studying Nehemiah's prayer in chapter 1. If you read through the entire book, you can't help but notice that there are 2 major prayers. The second one is found in chapter 9. But in our present chapter, there is another prayer, and you can nearly miss it. It is virtually hidden in verse 9. In the NIV, it is only 4 words long. Now strengthen my hands. This is not the first time Nehemiah shoots off a quick prayer to God. We first saw him do this when he was still in Susa. We see that Nehemiah's prayers vary from one sentence, emotionally based, spontaneous, and probably silent expressions of dependence on God, to extended, historically based, thoroughly reasoned, probably public proclamations of faith. There are other prayers too, and they fall in between these ends of the spectrum. This is all a way of showing that for this servant of God, prayer is a way of life. It is ongoing, always at the edge of his consciousness, always accessible at a moment's notice, ever adaptable, appropriate, necessary. This is part of the essence of being in relationship with God. By looking at the forest, we learn aspects of prayer that transcend the book of Nehemiah. No prayer is too short for God to hear it. And it is notable that Jesus never criticized a prayer for being too short, only for being too long. Communication with God is an ongoing daily process that is both formal and informal, complex and simple, scheduled and spontaneous. Not long ago, Pastor Wayne gave us a great guideline to follow. Let's look at the forest again. This time the forest has to do with God's sovereignty. Notice that in today's chapter an accusation is made. Sanballat makes it in a sneaky sort of way. He says, "It is reported among the nations that the Jews are planning to revolt." And basically this means that Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem are spreading rumors. To understand these rumors in context, we should look at the even larger forest of Ezra, Nehemiah. Ever since the Jews started to return to Judah, the Persian Empire has generally been supportive of them. But there was a period, as we see in Ezra 4, where the rebuilding efforts stopped because Artaxerxes received false accusations that the Jews were seeking independence from Persia. The king should know that if this city, Jerusalem, is built and the walls restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid. This city is a rebellious city, troublesome to kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. If this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. It's the same accusation, isn't it? What's more, Sanballat intentionally delivers his message in an unsealed letter so that it's sure to become common hearsay and public knowledge. From Nehemiah chapter 4, we know that Sanballat has an army, and Israel has none. So why can't he just overrun Israel and forcibly take Jerusalem over? The answer is that he cannot use military force because Persia has authorized Nehemiah's rebuilding efforts, and King Artaxerxes has ultimate authority in the land, and Nehemiah has the trust of Artaxerxes. That is why Sanballat and his cohorts have to resort to ridicule, intimidation, and threat, and when those things don't work, they have to use increasingly underhanded tactics. You see, as much as the governors of Trans-Euphrates think they have autonomy, Persia is sovereign over Trans-Euphrates, and God is sovereign over Persia. It's all about God controlling nations and world events to protect His people and ensure that His will be done. Because the major themes that run through Nehemiah, such as prayer and God's sovereignty, span multiple chapters, we see them best when we look at the forest. So let us not miss the forest for the trees.